When it comes to fitness, there are some core components that we can hone in on that allow us to ensure that progress is consistent and predictable. So these core components generally fall within two categories, either training or recovery. When we're looking at training, we have two primary foundational pieces. So the first one is proximity to failure. This focuses on how close are we getting to technical failure in a working set. If we want our body to progress, we have to give it a reason to, and that means pushing hard. For most movements, most of the time, when we're looking at strength or muscle development, we're looking at between roughly 1 and 4 reps left in the tank at any set. That means we only have 1 to 4 reps before we're hitting absolute technical failure. We can strategically dose in sets all the way to complete failure, but it has to be done with a purpose and thought out rather than just putting every single set for every muscle group all the way to failure. We have the ability to go higher or more reps left in reserve, 4, 5, 6 or more. If we're focusing on developing things like really honing in on technique, power, or speed development. For those particular areas, going much closer to failure isn't going to have as much of a benefit. There is a dramatic rate of diminishing returns. With proximity to failure in mind, the other core component here is volume. And when we're talking about volume right now, essentially that's going to mean the amount of working sets that we're pushing within a reasonable proximity to failure. So this is going to vary from person to person based on training age. And it's also going to vary based on the muscle group that we're focusing on. Some muscle groups just objectively can take more volume than other groups. Biceps and shoulders are an example of that for most people most of the time. Additionally, we might want to focus on more volume when we want to hone in on one particular muscle group. So, for example, we might have a chest that is lacking in strength or size, and we want to maybe take away some volume from other muscle groups and put that towards our chest. So, again, proximity to failure and volume are the core components that allow us to create an optimal environment for growth. And notice I said an optimal environment for growth, not inherently growth. So there are a few things that we need to do to ensure that we are recovering and locking in those gains from an adequate training. The first thing we're looking at is nutrition. And within nutrition, we have two primary areas, and that is micronutrients and macronutrients like protein, fats, carbs, and debatably fiber. Ensuring we have adequate nutrition is ensuring that our body has adequate fuel to recover from an adequate training stimulus. If we are lacking in nutrition, even if we had the perfect training protocol, if there ever was such a thing, we're not going to be able to lock in the gains from that training. So another aspect here is going to be sleep. And sleep is so powerful that if it wasn't natural, it would be a banned substance in the sports world. There could be an hour-long video just on sleep alone, but we want to make sure that we're getting an adequate amount of sleep most nights, if not all. So in addition to nutrition and sleep, we want to look at stress management. So stress management, similar to nutrition, has two variables. We have stress management in the gym and stress management outside of the gym. So stress management in the gym means that we're making sure we're distributing volume, distributing the amount of sets we are going to failure. Again, we don't want to take all sets to failure all of the time. Making sure that we're recovering adequately both within a session and between sessions, and so on. Stress management outside of the gym is life stressors, particularly life stressors that are unnaturally high for a sustained period of time. So things like very difficult work deadlines that we're having to push on a regular basis, which can be normal, but we don't want to have that as a sustained part of our life because it's going to keep cortisol levels very high, and high cortisol levels, chronically high cortisol levels can, among a myriad of other things, can really hamper our ability to lock in this growth. Another example of stress management outside of the gym is ensuring that our personal relationships are maintained fairly well. So we don't want to be constantly getting into arguments with significant others or those in our immediate circle. Again, this is something that is going to keep our stress levels very high, unreasonably high, for an unreasonable and unsustainable amount of time if we want to maximize growth. So let's assume that we have an adequate proximity to failure for most of our movements most of the time. We're hitting an adequate amount of volume, an adequate amount of sets that get us within a reasonable proximity to failure. That's going to create our environment to growth. And then to lock in our growth, we're checking off these boxes: nutrition, sleep, and stress management most of the time. So this, and excuse my terribly drawn lock, is going to lock in growth. So if we had a perfect training program, again, if there ever was such a thing, but lacked in recovery, we're not going to have optimal, consistent, or predictable results. And likewise, if we have a perfect recovery protocol, but our training is lacking, again, we're not going to be able to have consistent, reliable, and predictable results. So we need to have both of these locked in most of the time. And that is what's going to allow us to progress over time for the long term. For some people, it's unrealistic to do everything right all of the time. But the idea is that we have many variables here that we can focus on. So the idea is to do most things well most of the time, and progress will be inevitable.